in some very specific way. Jack Johnson, again, is really, really significant. He's really complicated. There are whole books about him, several documentaries and such, and you've only seen part of this one here, although the rest of it is online for you to see. I want you to take a look at the rest of it. But in particular, I wanted to sort of start the conversation on him, discuss, debate some of his complexities a bit, because he ultimately helps us talk about what a new Negro is, what a new Negro man was, and to see some of the outgrowths, some of the changes that the Great Migration would bring us. So in terms of these questions, number 3 says, how does Jack Johnson define manhood in your opinion? How does he define manhood in your opinion? Several times in the documentary that term manhood comes up, right? Johnson was explicit in sort of defining manhood. He would tell you what he thought manhood was. Maybe just as importantly, I think he tried to show you what he thought manhood was. Whether you agree or disagree, have problems with it, or not, he didn't really care. People commended him and looked at him as an ideal of manhood, but they also criticized his definition of manhood. But I'm interested in your thoughts. How do you think he defined manhood? How do you think he defined himself as a man? Give me a couple of examples. Not backing down, okay? So this notion that a man will not back down, especially with something you truly believe in, right? You hear that expressed a lot of different ways. Stand up on your own 2 feet, be a man. So sometimes it's that explicit, this notion of being a man. It's so commonplace that we don't even really explain it, right? Somebody will just tell you, be a man. You're supposed to know what that means, right? Sometimes we may get into trouble because people define what that means differently, but standing up for yourself. Dignity and pride, that's good, because it sort of brings us to these themes. And again, think about how that's really the opposite of the old Negro, right? The old Negro and the stereotypes of an old Negro, a Sambo, a Coon, in terms of the male stereotype, or a Mammy or Jezebel in terms of the female ones, were really unidentified caricatures of African Americans. Not created by African Americans, but they were things that African Americans had to deal with, had to respond to, had to decide how they were going to respond to it. So Johnson was very familiar with all those tropes, all those stereotypes, all those caricatures, and he crafts his own image against them, right? Against them in so many ways. And again, in many ways, it's interesting that he didn't care who was criticizing him, whether it was mainstream white society or whether it was other African Americans. He's like, you know what? You do you, I'm going to do me. Even at this very critical moment in American history, a very dangerous moment, as we've seen, where a lot of these choices could get you in some real trouble. He decided, I don't care. So those are good. Well, how else? How else do you think he defines manhood or new Negro manhood for himself? What do we see him either say or do? Did anyone else? Okay, he's going to make his own decisions. Again, think about these competing categories. You got slave on one hand, then you got man on the other. Now remember, slaves, male or female, were always really kind of considered like children. So to be an adult, really part of being an adult is making your own decisions and then dealing with the consequences of those decisions. So he's going to make his own decisions. I think that's particularly interesting in terms of the black criticism of him. Because, again, both Washington and Du Bois are going to come out, and they knew who Jack Johnson was. They commented publicly on him, in many ways showering accolades on him, but also showering criticism on him. Booker T. Washington is really interesting because he was, openly critical of Jack Johnson and how he was living his life, kind of flair and this and that. Yet he also is very much a fan. So the video talks about how Washington is very critical of this flamboyant behavior, running around with white women, blah, blah, blah. Yet, during these championship fights, Booker T. Washington sets up speakers all over Tuskegee's campus so everybody can hear the fight. This is one of those things where the entire community would stop and pay attention when he was fighting. It was much more than just about one boxing match. It was really seen as a larger contest. Again, Jack Johnson is an individual, but he's really sort of read as, almost the entire race in a sense. You heard him talk about fighting for the entire race. Right? Folks kind of were living and dying on the edge of their seat as he goes through these things. Du Bois, too. Very, I think, impressed with Jack Johnson kind of as a member of the talented temp in a sense. Right? This guy was talented, best fighter in the world. Yet, Du Bois and others in the NAACP and outside of it would criticize many of Johnson's choices. That for Johnson was a part of his manhood, especially the choices about hanging with white women. What is it? I forget if it was Du Bois or James Weldon Johnson that said, look, if you can't find a good black woman, then you need to just remain celibate, right? That it's not even about just you and your choice. It's about how that choice is going to get read. You're a hero to the race, and so therefore you can't make these decisions. Jack Johnson's like, wait a second. You or anybody else can't make these decisions for me. Right? That's what a slave has done for them. I'm a man. He's consistently saying I'm a man. Really interesting if you think about, especially the choices at that moment. Right? And we spent all this time talking about lynching and race riots and all these things, all the things you could get killed for. And Johnson says, look, kill me if you want to, but I'm going to live my life the way I want to live it. Right? That for him was his definition of manhood, at least in part. Again, in some ways it may become problematic. There's a lot of conversations, current conversations about definitions of manhood or masculinity. Interesting to see that there's a history to these conversations. Right? Actually, it's right around this time period that you start hearing the term masculinity for the first time, right around the 1890s. People talked about manhood before, like there was a definition of what manhood meant in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, 60s, 70s. It's interesting to see how it's going to change dramatically in this period. Before the 1880s, people said manhood, and they thought definitions of manhood, they thought about things like men were reserved, they never lost their temper, they were always in control, right, a kind of intellectual response, blah, blah, blah. By about the 1890s and 1900s, though, you start hearing about how American manhood is weak. American men have been made effeminate. Teddy Roosevelt, President Teddy Roosevelt, for example, is the perfect example of this. He was sickly as a child, very bad health, and so he specifically remakes his manhood or his masculinity publicly. He says, we as America, as a nation, need to become more manly. For him, that meant doing things like going on safari and hunting big game animals. So you see all these pictures of President Roosevelt with his, little safari gear, his gun, and the tiger he just shot. That's supposed to demonstrate his manliness. He did the same thing in his politics, right? His whole phrase, speak softly but carry a big stick, right? That America needed to be a more manly nation. It's interesting to see how definitions of manhood and masculinity would change in this period. It goes from being a definition of manhood where you were supposed to be reserved and not react, to really the opposite. Masculinity, definitions of masculinity were about physical reaction. Somebody disrespects you, you deal with it physically. Otherwise, you're not a man. So, for example, someone attacks your honor. You invite them to go outside and have a duel. So, yeah, you disrespected my family name. We're going to get pistols. We're going to go outside, and someone's going to die. Right? That's how serious it was. Interesting how, again, you think about problems with masculinity even today. Right? How often is it connected with violence? Somebody steps on your foot. How should you react as a man? Right? If you don't react a certain way, then you're seen as less than. A lot of folks die over some foolishness, even today. It's interesting to think how a lot of these things trace directly to this period. And so Johnson is seen as an emblem of masculinity, just as others like Teddy Roosevelt would be. Now, of course, for him, it's even more complicated. It's not just about American masculinity that's going through these changes, but it's about black American masculinity, which is already complicated, right? Lynching is all about, killing this dangerous masculinity. So it's really a fine line that someone like a Jack Johnson is trying to navigate, right? This color line is no joke, yet he felt like he really had to navigate it or wanted to navigate it in a certain way, right? So sometimes masculinity means, competing men, one man against another man, right? Competition against another man is often a conception, an idea about masculinity. You're trying to get the better of that man. So in some ways, boxing gets seen as the perfect emblem of that. You're literally in a ring with another guy, just you and him, and only one person's going to win. You got to outthink him, and you got to out-physical him. Right? Somebody's going to get knocked out. So it's interesting to think of that. But also, masculinity is often thought about how a man relates to a woman, right? For better or for worse. Think about how definitions of masculinity are often bound up with male-female relations. A lot of times men find themselves into trouble over that. Say you're having an argument with a lady, your wife or a lady or someone else, and you suddenly feel disrespected, right? A lot of men do not react well to that. Use violence or other things, right? They feel like it's so part of their definition that they have to react. See that all the time, today and then. Again, this stuff has a history to it. It's interesting to think about that. And even for Johnson, how he's going to interact with women is sometimes going to be problematic. Later on, some of the ladies he interacts with, one of the ladies he was close with tries to kill herself twice. Their relationship was so problematic in certain ways that couldn't deal with it. So obviously there's some issues, some challenges there. But for him, again, it was, here's one definition of man that I want to move away from, sort of slave, being told what to do. Nobody's going to tell me who I'm choosing. At the other level, maybe it can't go to an extreme. That's too far. These are complicated sort of discussions, but Johnson helps us, I think, to talk about them. That first question is interesting, too. Some of the examples of the rules of Jim Crow and the color line. We've seen already some of the examples. Some of them don't even seem to make sense about the rules of the color line. I've told you before about having to get off the sidewalk, right? They mentioned that in this documentary. You got to get off the sidewalk and stand in the mud while a white person passes, these kind of things. Written and unwritten rules. I'll come back to that in a second when we get into some of the stuff we see in chapter 15. Johnson knew all those rules, written and unwritten. Some of them he decides to just flaunt. Some of them he decides to ignore. Right? Some of them he decides to challenge openly. So that second question kind of picks that up. It says, how does Jack Johnson navigate or conquer the color line? We're using Du Bois's phrase, the color line that we talked about, this division between black and white. Yet Johnson's a new Negro and says, I'm going to find a way to navigate this color line in my own way. How does he do that? How does he try to navigate, or how does he challenge some of these presumed rules, notions, ideas about Jim Crow and how the society should be shaped? How do you see him challenging that, particularly in his behavior? Sometimes he would say, I'm going to do this, but quite often he just did it. What ways does he challenge the color line? Give me a couple of examples of that. Some of them may be tying into his manhood, but specifically this race problem with his color line. How does he do it?
Seemed like, obviously, times or whatnot, there was a color issue, but it seemed like he really didn't see color. He saw himself as a man. He was going to do with any other man, who wasn't black, white, purple.
That's good.
From the way he dressed, the way he spoke, and he's an athlete as well. So he felt as though the whites can do it, why not?
Okay.
So he had no preference when it came to that.
That's good. That's good example. Yeah, in some ways he's going to say, I'm not dealing with color. Look at the quote on the bottom of that sheet. The third quote is actually one from Jack Johnson that says exactly that. He says, I had found no better way of avoiding race prejudice than to act with people of other races as if prejudice did not exist. I'm just going to pretend it don't exist. Now, this is a really interesting response if you think about it in the 1890s, early 1900s. As folks are getting lynched, there are race riots all around. It's a dangerous, crazy time. He says, you know what, I don't see any of that. I'm not going to even deal with it. I'm not even going to engage it. I am a man. He almost tried to go beyond race in a sense to just be a man, right? To deal with that kind of gender identity. Yet, he knew race existed. Remember, his whole thing at this point is to become heavyweight champion, yet he has to overcome excuse me, traditions of racism to do it. He's going to follow around this heavyweight champion for 5 years trying to get a fight. It's 1905 when I stopped this video. He's like, look, I beat everybody out here. Let me fight. Let me get a shot. And the guy's like, no, there's no way I'm going to give you a shot. It's too important. So it's interesting how he even navigates that. When you see more of the rest of it, what you'll see is he literally follows the guy around the country. Every time he fights, Jack Johnson's there in the front row, like, what's up? He goes to the West Coast. He's on the same train, like, you got to see me at some point. They go back to the East Coast. Jack Johnson, like, hey, you heard how he ran into him in the bar in San Francisco. He says, let's fight. What was the heavyweight champion's response when he gets him in the saloon in San Francisco? He says, Let's do this. Did you hear that part? What does a heavyweight champion do? Yeah, he puts $2,500 on the bar and says, you know what, I'm not going to give you a heavyweight title. You and me, we can go down to the basement right now. Whoever comes back up gets the money. He's sort of so tired of the clowning at that point. He says, look, let's just go do this. I don't care when of us die. Johnson's like, no, I'm not trying to do that. He already was confident enough in himself. He says, I'm trying to take the heavyweight title. Right, that's not going to give me the title. It's not about your little money. So it's interesting on a number of levels how he's going to, and it ultimately works, but it's going to take 5 years. It's going to take 5 long years. 5 years in his prime, really, before he gets that shot. That's one way of how he would navigate the color line, but you're right. For the most part, he says, I'm not going to even deal with it. There's a rule that says I can't live in certain neighborhoods. What does he do? Lives in those neighborhoods. He moves right in the forbidden district. He just refuses to sort of engage some of those things. So it's interesting to think about how that might fit into the whole Washington Du Bois debate, for example. Do you see him as closer to Washington or Du Bois, based on some of his behaviors, some of his choices, some of his ideas, and some of the things he would do? How does he fit into this Washington Du Bois debate, which he was very familiar with, and they were both familiar with him? How do you see him fitting into that Washington Du Bois debate? Is he more of a Washingtonian, or do you think he's more of a Du Boisian, Mr. Jack Johnson? Asleep today? Got limited time, so tell me something.
I mean, he's getting which watch sports for. At the same time, he's doing a job that he's doing a job well and fights the boys on neither, but
Okay.
at the same time,
Okay, so I'd be both or neither. That's an interesting one. You're right. I mean, he has a skill. Right? I remember Washington is talking about develop a skill, and that'll be your way. Don't worry about race. So in some of the earlier discussions, it seems maybe he's Washingtonian. I'm not going to deal with the race problem. I'm not trying to vote. I'm trying to be heavyweight champion. You might also think of that as being close to Du Bois' talented tenant too. Du Bois is like, look, there are going to be some of us that are exceptional at certain things. We should be allowed to pursue those things. I mean, he's exceptional. Best fighter in the world, but he's not going to be allowed that opportunity because of his race. So it's interesting how he might fit both. He might fit neither one. Right? He definitely doesn't fit Du Bois' definition of how a black representative should act and all these sorts of things. And Washington's either. But it's interesting to see how he might be both or neither, right? In that sense, in terms of thinking of him in relation to that debate. That's under that key theme number 1 there. I want you to think about him as an example of maybe even a connection to the modern athlete. There's a huge discussion, ongoing debate about the role of the black athlete in contemporary culture. This is not new. Right? So Michael Jordan in the 1980s, when he's asked about the high price of his shoes and why he doesn't do more politically for the community, Jordan was like, look, Republicans buy shoes too. Very Washingtonian in his response, right? Economics. That's not my job. Why should it be their job, right? You don't want to ask white athletes to sort of do these things for the white community. Many black athletes say. Charles Barkley, when they asked him about, you're a role model, you need to behave a certain way, he said, no, I'm not. There's a whole, debate about this commercial, I'm not a role model, this and that, and don't look to me for anything. Yeah, you're paid millions of dollars and I'm in the public eye, but that doesn't mean anything. You should look to your parents. Which theoretically that's true. Right? You should look to your parents or whoever's taking care of you more than any athlete you've never met. That's theoretically true. But we also recognize the significance, especially the public significance, of a lot of key figures and how they may have an impact on particular communities with a particular history. Is that fair? No, not necessarily. A lot of things in life aren't fair. So part of what we want you to think about also moving forward with a figure like Jack Johnson is this is popular culture. Right? One of the questions in the ethnic notions was about why are these images, these negative images, so popular? Why they're consumed so readily by mainstream society. Popular culture is significant in part because it's so popular. People that have never seen an African American person before are going to see Jack Johnson. So some folks say he has a certain responsibility to do this and that. Others say, no, he shouldn't, but He would say, look, I'm just going to be me. Part of what we think about with this is how culture and politics are linked together. We're going to come back to that idea. We normally think of culture as being kind of separate over here, right? You got poetry, music, painting, art, drama, various types. And then over here you have politics, people voting, and this and that, these traditional politics. I want you to think about the way that they're quite often linked, how very often culture is political. He's just boxing, right? It's just, a performance. Yet, think about all the politics connected to that, all the significance connected to that. He could have been shot at his fights, that's true. Other people get killed after his fights. Several African Americans died celebrating after Jack Johnson fights. One guy in a streetcar gets his throat cut, as they talk about, because folks were so mad about them celebrating this guy winning. That's serious. We can have these conversations moving forward too. Whether or not that's a good or a bad thing is really kind of secondary. But I want you to think about this connection between culture and politics. The role of media. How is he portrayed? A lot of the media portrayals of him are very negative, these old Negroes. Yet he wants to portray himself in a certain way. It's not coincidental that he always has the nice clothes, those fur coats, right? He has the fastest cars. He's going to portray himself in a certain way. Again, a lot of it, I think, tying in the notions of manhood as well, but a lot of it trying to challenge these older Negro stereotypes. Okay, so that's some of the big picture things I wanted you to think about with Mr. Jack Johnson. I also want you to think about his connection to the period that we're talking about. We talked last time about 14. He also fits perfectly with 15. I want to say